Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, a discursive programme covering sensitive social issues in the Middle East. Today we'll be focusing on migrant worker abuse in the Gulf Cooperation Council. That is the region covering Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Human rights groups report that migrant workers routinely face physical, sexual, financial and psychological abuse in the Gulf states due to the Kafala or sponsorship system, which binds employee to the employer. With the worker's permission to remain and work in the country tied to the permission of a sponsor or kafil, migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. In our discussion, we'll be exploring how the sponsorship system undermines the balance between employer and employee, how workers are trapped, exploited and abused within the binding contract, and at a time when Qatar is under heightened media scrutiny in the lead-up to the 2022 World Cup, we'll be considering the likelihood of the Kafala system being abolished once and for all, as well as what improvements to labour laws are being made in the region. At this point, I'd like to welcome my studio guests, Dr. Hilary B. Stouffer, visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Stephen Russell, Policy Officer at the European Union and International Relations Department of the TUC Congress. Welcome both of you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, launching straight in. Hilary, how complicated is the issue of migrant worker abuse in the Middle East?
Incredibly complicated.
Or in the Gulf, should I say?
Well, both, very much so in the Middle East at large, but in the Gulf in particular, it's generally twofold. It's not just construction workers, but also domestic workers. Mm-hmm. And the biggest problem in a lot of ways is just how much foreign labor these countries need to import in order to meet their economic needs, or what they prefer to be their economic output. And so instead of putting the very best policies in place, the most progressive policies in place, the laws are playing catch up with the economic realities. And there's just so many considerations. There's also human trafficking and everything else involved.
And Stephen, where are the migrant workers coming from? What countries?
Well, the vast majority of them are coming from India and Nepal at the moment, and that's where most of our figures on casualties are coming from as well, because those embassies track the fate of the workers that go there. But there are large numbers from other countries, from the Philippines, increasingly from Africa, Kenya and the like. And recently an agreement's been made that 200,000 Pakistani workers would receive visas to go over to work. So the demographics are shifting slightly. Qatar is making agreements with new countries on a regular basis to facilitate the movement of workers.
Hilary, in many parts of the Gulf, as you said, foreign workers are outnumber the locals. Why? I mean, don't Arabs want to work in manual construction?
Well, no, they often don't. I mean, and that's not just true in the GCC countries, of course. In many developed countries, the middle and upper classes don't want to do manual labor, and so that it's important to recognize that as well. In some countries like Qatar, people generally don't have to work at all if they don't want to. They make such a great salary just on the basis of their citizenship that they don't have to work. And in some cases, they don't have the skills. I mean, they don't have the skills for manual labor in the oil industry. And in other times, their universities aren't as good as we might want them to be. And they're still moving forward on these issues.
So we mentioned the Kafala system.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk a little bit about it?
Well, I understand that it differs slightly from country to country, but from the point of view of Qatar, what it essentially means is that the workers are trapped and entirely at the whim of their employer. This is exacerbated by the fact that unscrupulous recruitment companies will promise all kinds of pay-in conditions, which, once the workers arrive to take their job, they're no longer able to respond to that broken contract by leaving the country, because the exit visa in Kafala in Qatar means that they're trapped there until their employer lets them go. They can't change jobs without the permission again of the employer, and so on. And this, of course, leaves them vulnerable to all kinds of abuses, because although there are labour laws in Qatar designed to protect those workers, they can always be overridden by the power inherent in that unequal relationship between the sponsor and the employee.
So someone in Nepal desperately seeking work will meet an agent in Nepal,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're promised
They're promised certain kind of work, and there are countless examples of workers being promised higher grades, technical work that they are qualified for, and being asked on arrival to do much more menial manual tasks, and also automatic pay cuts, if you like, of a third or more. But there's nothing they can do about it.
And how problematic is this system?
It's a big problem, mainly because it keeps everybody from having freedom of movement. In mature labor markets, you get hired, you have a contract. If you don't like it, you leave at the end of your contract period, but you don't have to ask your employer permission. If something's really wrong, you can just quit. And then, of course, maybe you have some issues getting back pay, but no one's keeping you locked in a room, having you refuse to leave. In the situation of migrant workers, specifically domestic workers, in many of the Gulf countries, their employers physically control where they live, where they eat, how they can move around. And so the Kafala system, in particular, as Stephen said, stops people from having freedom of movement, and that's kind of the biggest problem.
Okay, well, welcoming now over the phone in Delhi is Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, Vice Chair of the Manipal Advanced Research Group, UNESCO Peace Chair, and Professor of Geopolitics at Manipal University in Delhi. Professor Nalapat, can you briefly outline why so many workers seek work in the Gulf?
Well, the reason for that is that there's no work at home. And yes, conditions there are terrible. But sadly, the reality is that for many of them, the conditions back home are sometimes even worse. Now, we are seeing, for example, that the South has done better economically. The North, some of the states in the North have not. So increasingly, the workers who are going to the Middle East are going from the northern states that are very backward. So the main problem, actually, is sheer economic want.
And what sorts of things are workers being promised in their home country?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there does not seem to have been an organized effort, either by the media or, by a sufficient number of NGOs or by the government to really educate the workers as to their rights, whatever little rights there are, and as to the actual conditions that take place in different locations. The fact is that there is no comprehensive handbook, for example, showing the rights and also the actual conditions. So the reality is that many of the workers get fooled by agents who basically take large amounts of money from them and send them on this trip. The reality is, unfortunately, that people who are given, let's say, a contract to bring in 1,000 workers or 500 workers, they auction these jobs to people, and unfortunately, people pawn their wives' jewelry, they sell their land, they sell their property, and they become even more destitute as a result.
And how much of a role do migrant home countries play, say in India or Bangladesh? Do they have any authority as to what over their workers' rights?
Well, the reality situation is that the governments in South Asia, for example, are very cautious in dealing with the countries of the GCC, for the reason that the workers send back a substantial sum of remittances, and this sum is often, almost enough to pay for the cost of the oil that is bought by, for example, India or Bangladesh from these countries. So the reality is that the governments here are very reluctant to confront the governments there about the treatment of workers, and the governments there says, look, this is the private sector. These are people who are not in government at all who are employing them, and we don't know what's going on, so how can we be held responsible?
Professor, I'm just going to bring in Stephen here. Have you also picked up on this caution from the migrants' home countries?
Well, we saw a very clear example of that at the International Labour Organization, which earlier this year wanted to send a commission of inquiry or a high-level inquiry into the country to find out the facts, find out the truth of what was going on, because there have been a lot of disputes about the the exact nature of the conditions for migrant workers. And rather than welcoming that as an opportunity to prove that it was enacting the reforms that had been promised and helping workers, Qatar spoke against that and managed to enlist the support of quite a lot of countries from the South Asian region. Now, these are countries whose own citizens are going to Qatar, where they're being told by those people asking for inquiry that bad things are happening to them, that their conditions are poor, their living conditions and working conditions are appalling. And their response was to support Qatar in blocking that inquiry. Now, that suggests that what your guest says is absolutely true, and that there are other pressures of an economic nature kind of staying their hand, stopping them speaking out too firmly in case they spoil what is clearly a beneficial arrangement to the overall economy.
Hilary, do you think it's just about economy?
I think it's about many things, but it is about economy to some extent. The leverage that the receiving countries have basically over the sending countries is one that they are so much richer, and there are other international relations going on here. It's not only about workers' rights. There are other things that these countries have in common. For the sending countries that are also Muslim, they have other considerations that they're working on behind the scenes for their foreign policies, and so it's not only about the economy, but it is in a large part about economy.
So it's an extension of the Kafala system, really?
It can be.
Kind of.
That's one way to think of it.
Yeah. Professor, how are governments in Nepal and India, Bangladesh, dialoguing with the Gulf states?
Well,
is there any dialogue?
There is a dialogue, for the record. There is a dialogue to convince people and convince their own citizens that they're doing something about the abysmal conditions that their citizens are kept in these locations. But I think it's very important that the international media, for example, does a lot more to highlight this kind of situation. A lot of the workers' contracts are actually slave labor, and the salaries also are absolutely pitiful. So in reality, what happens is that the worker takes about a year or a year and a half to pay back the loan shark or the others who have sent him where he's gone, and then he has to work for about 5 or 6 or 7 years more to earn something to come back with. So in a sense, it's a form of indentured labor, and indentured labor ought to, frankly, go out of business.
Professor Nalapat, we have to leave you now, but I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Stephen, just picking up on another point mentioned by Professor Nalapat, the need for the media to highlight these issues at a greater extent. Do you not think the media is already talking about it quite a fair bit?
Well, the media is certainly talking about it quite a lot here in the UK. A number of media outlets have been very progressive in their attempts to find out what's really happening and publicise that. I would say in a way that perhaps they're less interested in workers' rights in the UK than they are sometimes in Qatar. But certainly we've found it very easy to engage with the media here, and we think the message has been louder here than maybe it has been in some other countries. But as the professor said, that may not be the case in sending countries. And although he outlined exactly why any kind of government prohibition on travel would be difficult to enforce, that doesn't excuse them from the responsibility to make sure people know what they're getting into. He talked about all the people who would fight for the chance to go to El Dorado, but that's because they really do think it is, a city of shining gold that's going to make them rich. And if they knew the risks, at least it would be their grown-up responsibility rather than them as victims of fraud. They have taken that risk for themselves.
But the media are talking here about it, but are the politicians doing enough?
No, they're not. We are engaged in dialogue with the government, and clearly in exactly the same way that the South Asian states have economic ties, clearly the British do as well. Under the coalition government, we did have feedback from the government that they were aware of the problem and were watching, but since the election we've not even seen that level of concern. They tend to be easily sucked in by, or at least cling on to willingly, the PR-friendly initiatives that emerge from Qatar, which thus far have failed to be substantiated with genuine action.
Hilary, Qatar has obviously been in the focus in the media. Can you describe a typical day for a manual worker in Qatar?
I think it would have to be, you would have to, first of all, decide if we're talking about a domestic worker, so someone who works in the home, or a construction worker.
Construction first.
So a construction worker, they live in these enormous group dormitories where there's thousands and thousands of people are stuffed into very small living conditions. They get up, they work under 50 degrees Celsius heat for 12, 15, 18-hour days with few breaks, little food in some conditions, little water in some conditions, and then they go home and start it all over again. It's not always like that. Sometimes the working conditions are okay, but they're never great, and they could be. These countries are rich enough to make sure that their employees, their foreign workers, have excellent working conditions, and they're not choosing to. Everybody, whether it's the UK government, Indian government, the Qatari government, or whoever else, is pushing it off on somebody else, saying it's not my problem. So the Qataris say it's the sending country's problem, the sending country says it's the receiving country's problem, and the rich developed world of the West says, well, we're not sending people anyway, so we'll let them work it out at home. And everybody is just avoiding responsibility, and we really need to get together and find a cohesive answer to this.
Stephen, according to data released from the Nepali government, the embassy in the Gulf countries, 549 Nepali migrants died in 2014. What is the most common form of death?
The most common form of death amongst that is the mysteriously phrased sudden adult death. I mean, it's essentially heart attacks is the official designation. Unfortunately, what that means is that under Qatari law, that doesn't require any autopsy, and also, rather conveniently, doesn't require any compensation to be sent to the families of the deceased. What that really means is that you're in a situation where the vast majority of people dying have no investigation into the causes, and so automatically you're reduced to conjecture in the absence of anything firmer. But a lot of people have suggested that this particular type of death can be linked to dehydration, which links into the heat that they might be working in, and also the reports of very limited access to clean drinking water, both in the accommodation camps at night and during the working day.
Because didn't Qatar say actually not one migrant worker has died on a construction site? There is this heart condition, as they say.
Yeah.
I mean, if it does exist, it's quite tricky ground, isn't it?
It is quite tricky ground. I mean, I'm not a medical professional, and I have never examined a expired labor worker in Qatar. But I think the government would say that, and this you run into that in any government, but especially there, no one is going to see these migrant workers. Very little do we get to see them up close and see what really happened and investigate and have an autopsy. So we don't know what's happening. But if the government says that not one death has happened, that they live in a closed society, it's hard for anyone to investigate that.
Well, now joining us from Seattle is Andrew Gardner from the University of Puget Sound. So he's Associate Professor of Anthropology, whose many publications include City of Strangers, Gulf Migration, and the Indian Community in Bahrain. Andrew, where does the Kafala system come from traditionally?
That's a great question, Anna, and I don't think that anyone has yet to really publish the authoritative version of an answer to that story. But the kinds of things that scholars talk about, first of all, is that this is a very traditional form in the region for vouching for outsiders in what Hillary called a somewhat closed society. And so there was this notion of trading a responsibility for the guests or foreigners as well. Other scholars point to colonial and post-colonial sort of industrial relations and the need for labor as the time and the place where this form of relationship came out. And then I think we can all agree that there's certainly some echoes of the kind of indentured servitude that was normal in the pearling industry of the past centuries in the region as well. But I don't think there's one singular source that we can point to when it comes to the kafala.
So traditionally it is for hospitality reasons?
That's correct.
Okay. And could you tell us about your research involved as an ethnographer in the Gulf, interviewing migrant workers, and whether there was a particular story that stuck out for you?
Yeah, well, I have, I guess, 10 or 15 years of experience sort of immersing myself, as we anthropologists do, in the life worlds of this transnational labor force, trying to understand their experiences and what's happening on both ends of these migrations. Now, I think, as far as your question, though, is there one story that sticks out? I mean, there's hundreds of stories that I've collected and analyzed over the years, and many of them are quite compelling and quite sad and quite extraordinary, and some, quite joyous and wonderful as well. But I think the message, that those of us who've been looking at this system for a long time have is actually right there, is that the kafala, it's different than the systems by which we in the West have governed migration. And it distributes the responsibility of that governance to individual citizen sponsors, their proxies, or businesses. And it's through that distribution that we see this enormous variability in experiences. So a migrant who gets a good sponsor under the kafala or works for a good business has a wonderful, or at least remunerative period of time that he or she is in the Gulf. But conversely, at the same time in this system, it allows, those kinds of exploitations to occur, because it all depends on that individual or that business with which the migrant is matched up.
So there are good sponsors, and did you come across more good sponsors or bad sponsors? As trivial as that sounds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time counting and don't have the ability to do too much sort of counting of these things. Gathering those kinds of statistics to authoritatively answer a question like that is a very tricky endeavor, especially in the Gulf states. And I think like many journalists and others, have focused on some of the worst of these stories. But I think it's important, especially in scholarship, that we not ignore some of the excellent stories that are also occurring at the same time and continue to draw men and women to the region. And I've written about how those stories, those success stories, travel this transnational divide as well.
And Andrew, how does not knowing the language and culture affect the workers in the host country?
Well, in my one quantitative or statistical endeavor in Qatar, in the region, we set up a sort of proxy to figure out migrants who were doing well and migrants who were struggling. And it was obvious to us that language played a very substantial and significant role. And this was echoed again in our more recent study of the Qatari justice system and migrants' experiences in that justice system. And it doesn't take an anthropologist or a researcher to really understand the basic terrain of the answer to that question. Whether it's Arabic or English, the two sort of lingua franca of the Gulf states, an ability to communicate in those languages allows migrants to begin to understand and address their own problems and to deal with their own problems. Otherwise, they're dependent on other people who might be able to communicate across this, really extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity that we see among the workforces in the Gulf states.
Andrew, I'm going to bring in Hilary here. You were nodding there. I just wanted to...
Well, I was thinking, I agree with everything that he'd said, and one of the other issues with language is if you don't speak the language of the country where you work, it's very hard to ask for help. Even if methods or avenues for help were available, if you don't know how to approach the police or how to approach the labor regulators, it's very difficult to complain about working conditions if that's necessary, or even get medical care if you needed it. And I think sometimes there are bosses who exploit that. They know that the workers can't complain, and so they do everything they can to make sure they don't have any avenues to ask for help. One thing that could be used in order to help mitigate this is to give workers language courses when they get there, and give them training so that they know where they're supposed to go if something's wrong.
But isn't the agent supposed to be the help?
The agent could be the help. It depends on what the agent's role is. In some ways, the agent's role is just to find the workers and drop them off. In others, you would hope that they're there to help them along, but that would actually depend on the individual contract. There isn't one overarching contract that governs all the workforces in the GCC countries.
So I suppose it's quite convenient if a worker doesn't know the language. I mean, it gives them control. What would you say, Stephen? I don't know.
I think that's absolutely true, but what Hillary's saying is that you need to empower the workers, and she's talking about empowering through language, but of course it's very important to remember that one of the problems here is the massive imbalance in power and legal rights, and that what we need to see is both the ability to understand the laws protecting you and to have those laws enforced so that workers have rights and, utilising their language skills, can access those. Now, we have a constant conversation going on between people campaigning on this issue and the Qatari authorities over both new laws that they promise but don't bring in, but also enforcement of existing laws, such as passport confiscation, supposedly illegal. People keep taking their passports anyway. Now, if the legal system was working properly and workers knew that they were supposed to have full control over their documents and knew where to go if someone took those documents away, that would be a sign of a healthy system of redress that balanced more finely the rights of employers and employees, and that's clearly failing.
Okay, well, Andrew, with a buoyant economy such as in the Gulf region, why are workers paid such paltry amounts of money and in some cases no money?
Well, that's an interesting and tough question in some ways, but I think it's because they can be paid that amount. And, you know, there are these notions in the Gulf that they're being paid or their salaries are appropriate to the country from which they're coming from. And you see these kinds of national inequalities between the workforce that are an attempt to sort of reflect the global inequalities and the kinds of norms that we see in the world today. I also think, though, in kind of building on what Hillary and Stephen were saying in answer to the previous question, I think it's important to remember that this isn't just Qataris or Emiratis sort of exploiting helpless workers, but rather there's transnational industries and entrepreneurs involved in this. And truth be told, over the past 5 years, I've begun to get this sense that actually the region is kind of a magnet for exploitative elements in what Michaela Pelikan, another scholar and academic, calls the visa industry, or we might think of it as the migration industry. So this exploitation of workers under this system has begun to sort of draw its own set of migrants whose job is managing and profiting from the flow of transnational labor to the region.
That's interesting. So stopping it would jeopardize a lot of people's lives.
I think that's true, but I think in countries like Qatar and the Emirates, we're talking mostly about other foreigners whose profits are entirely wrapped up in this particular industry. When we get to some of the less wealthy Gulf countries, and I'm thinking of Bahrain, for example, there we see sort of more interactions and entrepreneurship between citizens and direct involvement of citizens and foreigners with these sorts of issues and relations.
And Andrew, what's your solution to the problem, in your opinion?
Yeah, what is the silver bullet for this question? Well, that's something especially us academics really puzzle and tussle over. But in this particular case, I do think that a sort of market-based solution might be the best answer. And I think the kinds of things that Hillary, Stephen, and many others, including myself, are calling for, which is allowing workers to change jobs, basically, allowing that kind of mobility, could resolve quite a few different issues. In fact, the migrants know when they have a terrible boss or employer and when they have a good one, and they're looking for better ones. And I think using that mechanism, it could kind of sift out some of the problems, sort of exclude some of the most problematic elements in people in this system, and benefit the country as a whole as well.
Well, Professor Garner, unfortunately that's all we have time for, but thanks so much for your expertise today.
Sure, no problem. Glad to be here.
Stephen, that was an interesting point, well, many interesting points about mobility. So I was going to ask you, do you think the Kafala system is a modern day form of slavery? But it can also be adapted if there were changes to it.
Yeah. What we would like to see principally, and we did hope that this was something that was going to happen, is an end to the exit visa requirements and the certificate of no objection before workers can change employers. There are a lot of other things we want to see urgently, but I think if you wanted to do one thing that would immediately improve conditions for a lot of workers, it would be that. Because as Andrew said, the moment you can say, I'm not putting up with this, and go and work for someone else, and you have developed skills, and possibly language skills as well as technical skills, that make you more and more valuable the longer you're in Qatar, that's how you create a job market where employers are incentivized to respect and treat their workers decently. At the moment, yes, there are good sponsors, but those bad sponsors have absolutely no reason to reform other than the kind of outside pressure we're trying to put on them.
And Henry, if a worker were to finish or terminate the contract or leave early, what happens? Have you got any cases?
Well, often they can't. I mean, there is no exit for them, so they don't get to quit. If they try to quit or walk off the job, in some cases, in some countries, the authorities will just pick them up and take them back to their abusive worker. So the issue is that there really isn't an exit in a lot of ways, and Stevens has highlighted this in Qatar, but there's other countries as well. There isn't an exit strategy. You are absolutely stuck in this terrible, if it is a terrible working condition, and there's nothing you can do, because in something that Andrew highlighted as well, these are not democracies, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You don't have to have a democratic system of government, but there's no checks or balances. There's one party in charge of everything. And so when that happens, they're all kind of working in concert on their own behalf for their own good, as opposed to for the good of the worker.
And there are obviously no trade unions, workers' unions. So there is absolutely no help whatsoever.
Indeed, workers don't have anyone to represent them, but they don't have anyone to advise them or put them in touch with places where they can find help. If you really wanted the silver bullet, we would say freedom of association and collective bargaining, because put simply, everything we've discussed in terms of the imbalance of power, the access to justice, problems with language, can all be overcome if workers can group together and find the appropriate people to lead and help and negotiate, and all those things that would make the employment relationship that much fairer.
Okay, well, now moving on to our next section, where we'll see what measures are currently being taken to improve the situation for workers and whether laws on paper are really making a difference. Stephen, in Qatar, I know we're focusing a little bit on this, but there are inspectors and monitors, aren't there, set up in place to watch what is happening to the workers and abuse. I mean, how effective are these?
Well, we've been in conversation with the Qatari authorities over the last few years. As of last year, there were about 300 inspectors covering the whole country. Now, they promised to increase that number. We haven't got the latest figures as to what they've increased it to. It takes time to properly train inspectors to do their job properly. But you were looking at a situation where if you were going to inspect every single employer and workplace in Qatar, you could visit one a day. Now, of course, with the administrative burden of following up investigations, I mean, that's clearly insufficient. What they did do this year, which may or may not be encouraging, was they finally enforced the law on daytime working in summer. Now, we'd been criticising them for some time, saying that no single employer had ever been prosecuted for allowing workers to work in the 50-degree heat that Hillary described. And shortly after the Shura Council squashed the attempts to reform Kafala, the inspectors were out in force, finally enforcing this other law. So that was an interesting good and bad mixture, is that as one reform fell, they finally felt compelled to take action to enforce something else.
And Hillary, do you think the Western media gives a fair analysis when reporting about the Gulf?
They're trying to. In some ways, these are great stories, and everyone's after a great story. Everyone wants the story that is easily tweetable or easily shared on Facebook, and so you are looking for terrible stories because that's what gets the headlining, that's what gets the interest. And right now, especially as the World Cup will eventually be in Qatar in a couple of years, it's obviously in the news because that's a big international event everyone's paying attention to. Another issue is the Western media may not have the access, though. They may only get access to a very small thing, so they can only report on the one construction site that they visited. It's harder to go and to get the visas, to go and talk to domestic workers or construction workers. And so in some ways, they're reporting on the only thing that they're able to see, which may not be an entirely fair representation, but it is such a constant and persistent reporting out of the GCC countries that these migrant workers are being mistreated, that at some point you have to say there's no smoke without fire.
Stephen, what sort of language should journalists use when dialoguing or when talking about Qatar or Saudi Arabia or all that region? It's delicate, it's sensitive.
Well, it is, but of course, so is the health, clearly, of the workers. What we really don't want this to become about is any kind of Qatar bashing or bashing of people in the Middle East. There are certain elements out there that we know who are seeking to exploit this against Qatar. But our campaign is absolutely not about that. And as we've said before, if Qatar agreed to all our demands on workers' rights tomorrow, which I realise they won't, we would actually welcome their stewardship of the World Cup. We have no problem. We don't care how hot it is, really, as long as you can have it at a time of year where the players' health is fine. We're not even interested that much in corruption. That's more of an issue for FIFA, and it's FIFA that should be sorting out why they allowed possibly irregularities to take place in the bidding process. Not our concern. We're worried about the workers. Now, having said that, Qatar are incredibly frustrating in the way they deal both with us as campaigners and lobbyists and with the media. The arrest of the BBC film crew earlier this year, who were invited on an official tour to view some of the new accommodation that was being built to house workers, the BBC crew snuck off to have a look at some of the real conditions, if you like, off the beaten track, and were immediately snatched and imprisoned and their equipment impounded. Doesn't give that kind of good sort of sense of, yeah, okay, we'll be fair with you if you're fair with us relationship. There were a couple of British Nepalese researchers last year similarly snatched from the streets, and unlike the BBC crew, it was 10 days before the authorities admitted they'd done this. They are trying to close down access to the country, and from that point of view you then enter a more adversarial relationship between them and medias and campaigners who see aggressive responses and therefore feel less compelled to respond with that intense balance that the best journalists, of course, would seek to bring in.
Now welcoming over Skype is Rothna Begum, researcher on the Middle East and North Africa women's rights at Human Rights Watch. Rothna, we've spoken a bit about migrant workers, manual workers in the Gulf, but there is also widespread abuse of domestic workers in the GCC. How bad is the problem, and what are the obstacles that female domestic workers face?
That's right. There's an estimated 2.4 million domestic workers within the Gulf states, and they face a wide range of abuse, ranging from lack of salaries to no rest periods, working incredibly long hours, up to 21 hours a day even, excessive workloads, food deprivation, and even confinement to the workplace. In some cases, they even report physical and even sexual abuse. Some of these situations amount to forced slavery, including trafficking or even slavery.
In Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, they exclude domestic workers from their labour laws. I mean, why are domestic workers discriminated against in particular?
So domestic workers' labour is not considered to be labour in the sense of other workers. And unfortunately, that is then legalized or put into law. So we've seen that across the Gulf states, many of them exclude domestic workers from their labor laws, such as Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. But Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait have also failed to properly legislate for domestic workers' rights in law as well. Kuwait's law, which was recently enacted in June, provides for the most advanced protections in comparison to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Bahrain does include domestic workers within their labour law, but in practice it excludes them from most of the protections of the labour law, such that it almost amounts to very little. So, for instance, they have no limits to working hours. They have no minimum wage under the Bahraini labour law because they're excluded from that in comparison to other workers.
And we do know about suicide rates? How common is suicide amongst domestic workers?
Suicide rates are reported. It's not quite clear just how many there are. It's more prevalent in places like Kuwait, but that's partly because the population of domestic workers in Kuwait is incredibly high. We're talking about 660,000 estimated domestic workers within Kuwait alone, comprising about a third of the labour workforce. And suicides are very publicized about as to whenever a woman commits suicide, but in other Gulf countries we don't hear of these cases as much because it's less reported, where it means that it's not happening. And the other problem is that we don't actually always know whether or not they were actually suicides or more sinister forms of abuse, where they may have actually died from trying to escape abuse, or where they were in effect murdered by their employers.
Okay, and sexual abuse obviously happens, but it's underreported. Why is that?
So sexual abuse is a whole range. We're talking about sexual harassment, where male employees and members of the family, initiate or say certain things to their domestic workers, to sexual assault, where they start to grope them and try to even attempt to rape them, and cases of rape itself. And domestic workers can face a whole range of that. Sometimes, it can get increasingly dangerous for them to be in that household. Now, when the reason why domestic workers are more at risk than compared to other workers is because they live in that household. So they are fully within a very private space where there is no one else entering this household to check on them. So one, they are more vulnerable, but two, when they are trying to report these situations, it's very difficult to work out whether to inform the authorities and get them to believe your story. Because what employees can do easily is to say that you actually have a boyfriend and that there was no such relationship, and then they can just simply counter that by denying that he ever existed. Often the problem is that it's also a taboo issue. So domestic workers also have the problem, like other women do, in even reporting the act of sexual abuse, because it's such a horrific thing to have happened to them. And when they do, they often find that their allegations are dismissed, or when they end up at the police stations, that they might, even when they've tried to attempt to take cases forward, it doesn't go very far. So, for instance, one woman in the UAE who was raped by her employer, as well as subject to many other abuses, she wanted a day in court. She was a very young woman, and she was saying, he raped me and he needs to go to jail for this. And she said, I want my day in court. And she went to the police took her to the court and everything. But 4 months later, she never had that day in court because she had no idea what was going on. The court basically told her, we will get back to you and we will tell you when you can come back again. But she's spending month after month with no salary, with no guarantee that she will receive justice. And by the end of it, she told me, I'm going to have to drop my case and return home, but he's going to get away with it.
So where was she living at that time?
Sorry?
During the 4 months, where was she living?
She was residing in an informal shelter, because the problem is when you leave your employer's home in the Gulf states, and these are all of the Gulf states now, you are effectively considered to have absconded your contract. So you are punished for having left your employer's home and for leaving them. So you're considered a runaway worker, and your employer can report you as absconded. Now, even where you are claiming that your employer has abused you, you can often actually be arrested instead. And in situations where you might not be arrested and the police may even be helping you trying to get a case against your employer, you are still not allowed to transfer to another employer, because this all exists within what's known as the Kafala system. This is the visa sponsorship system that ties you to your employer and prevents you from transferring your employment to another employer without the permission of your initial employer. So your employer may be incredibly abusive, but unless they give you permission to work for somebody else, there is no way you can work for anyone else.
I think it's interesting what you said about the domestic framework. There's almost an unhealthy dynamic that occurs within the home and within the parameters of the private space that creates this psychological abuse to grow.
That's right. I mean, this is Part of the problem is that domestic workers are not deemed as real workers because they exist within this private household, and they're doing work that's considered women's work, and women's work has often been considered not real work. And when you've now delegated it to a migrant domestic worker who's come all the way from another land and is living in your home, there's a drive to ensure that she's working as much as possible. Often people that I've spoken to, including recruitment agencies, employers, always say to me things like, oh, she's not really working. You know, she's sitting there and she'll be watching television, but of course she's scrubbing while watching television. But they don't consider it work. And they will be giving incredibly excessive workloads. But when women I speak to, when I ask them, what did you do during your day-to-day work? What were you expected to do? And they will say, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning to get the kids ready for school. Then I would prepare breakfast. Then I will start cleaning the floors. Then I would start putting the laundry. Then I will be getting ready for lunch. And the list of activities they have to do, and that they do this up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then have to sleep only for 3 hours that night in order to get up and start all over again. It's incredibly excessive workloads. And this is undermined, not just in the Gulf states, but across the world, that domestic work is real work. And women constantly have to, battle with the fact that they rarely have time to rest, let alone to even have days off, and let alone to have any of these rights to be instituted in the law itself.
And Rathana, you mentioned Kuwait. The law passed by Kuwait's National Assembly is the country's first regulating the labour rights of domestic workers. I mean, could you briefly outline what changes have been implemented?
Absolutely. So Kuwait's new law, for the first time, gives labour law protections to domestic workers. It now provides domestic workers with 1 day off a week, maximum working hours of 12 hours a day, as well as annual leave of 30 days per year, and end of service benefits as well. So this now entrenches into law some of the rights that domestic workers should be accorded. Unfortunately, it's still weaker than the labour law that exists for other workers. So for instance, the 12-hour working day is much more excessive than the 8-hour working day that is provided to other workers. It is still possible for Kuwait to ensure that the law is in compliance with providing equal protections to domestic workers like other workers, but also to ensure that it's in compliance with the international standards for domestic workers. And they can do so by ensuring their executive regulations, which they are currently drafting, meets those standards. So the law, where it fails, is covered by those implementing regulations.
And in reality, are these laws being respected and practiced in Kuwait?
Well, the law has since only just passed, so it has to be officially enacted in the official gazette, which should happen soon. And it won't be enforced until the implementing mechanisms are written up and also passed. So we're not going to see anything really change until in about 6 to 7 months.
And do you see other Gulf states following Kuwait's lead and protecting the rights of domestic workers?
We, as Human Rights Watch, have been pushing other Gulf states to follow Kuwait's lead, ensuring that all domestic workers are accorded labour law protections within the law. And at the same time, we're pushing on Kuwait, as well as other Gulf states, to reform the Kafala system. Because despite having labour law protections, it will do very little if domestic workers continue to be punished for leaving their employers when they have been abusive towards them. They need to be in a situation where they are allowed to transfer employers in certain scenarios. So in this situation, domestic workers will continue to find themselves confined to homes with their labour law rights being breached if they cannot leave that home and work for another employer. If their employer knows that they continue to have completely undiluted power over their workers and confined to them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rathana. That's all we have time for now, but thanks for joining us on the programme today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, regarding Qatar, it's estimated that 62 workers will die for each match played.
Yes.
Is that the fact? Or the estimated?
Yeah.
Imagined, maybe. Should the World Cup continue in Qatar?
If nothing changes, no, it shouldn't. Qatar secured the World Cup on an agenda of massive construction and development in the region. FIFA should have known what that entailed, given the rights of workers there. They should never have awarded it in the first place without guarantees of change. However, if they are prepared to make the necessary reforms and changes that would protect workers from certainly the worst of this, and hopefully the next level down as well, then we don't have a problem with it. I mean, there's a moral argument that they've already caused so much suffering that they don't really deserve to have it, but that's the kind of thing where you wouldn't get any progress in the world if you took that kind of moralistic stance. You have an opportunity here for Qatar to really be what it claims to be when it bids for these sporting things, which is a beacon, which is something different in the region, to say, here you are, come and look at us, we're modern, we're outward facing, we want to do something different and show people what the Middle East can be about. The frustration is that what they're currently showing is the ugly side of what the Middle East can be about, and that's just as bad for them in the long run as it is for the workers who are suffering.
And Hilary, more generally in the Gulf, how can we make a difference? How can the average person?
For specifically about the World Cup or just in general?
In general, about workers' rights, domestic and manual.
You can't, I mean, so we everyday consumers, if you will, I guess you could be more careful about the things that you buy. There are boycott campaigns against countries where they don't like the way that certain people are treated. So this happened in South Africa. Obviously, it's happening in Israel and Palestinian territories right now. Consumers could look into where, you know, if any goods coming out of the Middle East are made by these kind of workers in terrible conditions. But more generally, unfortunately, we are so far removed from the plight of a construction worker building a World Cup stadium. You could, I guess, decide not to go to the World Cup. That's going to be a very small portion of the population anyway, though, that has the opportunity to go. You could decide not to give your tourism and travel dollars to the countries in the Gulf, if that were an option of yours. Or you could pressure your own government to improve its relations with these governments and improve its condemnation of the terrible conditions that they find. And we have that option in a lot of ways that other countries don't, because our governments are more responsive to us.
Stephen, anything to add?
Well, there is a hierarchy in football, certainly, with the fans there at the bottom waiting to be, you know, if a cynical person would say, exploited by the commercial forces that have gathered around international football. And we've been working with football fans to raise awareness there with what's going to happen. Now, if we succeed in doing that, and we've got a good relationship with a number of the official fans groups, such as the Football Supporters Federation, but what that means is that those people seeking to benefit from a relationship with FIFA and with the World Cup in Qatar may look again at the benefits to them as sponsors, because they want to sell their products to these fans, these consumers of football, if you like. And as we've said before, the way things are at the moment, this is a bit like sponsoring an oil slick. You're putting your name on something ugly and unpleasant. And the more people that realise what's really happening, the more that will hold true. On the other hand, fix it, start treating workers well, show that the Qatar World Cup is an engine for positive change in the world. That becomes something you very much want to be associated with as a sponsor, and something we'd encourage all fans to back the World Cup under those circumstances.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Just to conclude, it is said that labour migration to GCC countries is expected to grow in the coming decades and will therefore remain a critical public policy challenge. The Qatar 2022 World Cup has put the Gulf states in a timely spotlight over the treatment of migrant workers in the region. Greater transparency, dialogue and collaboration is needed across the board, from the migrant workers' countries of origin, governments in the Gulf, NGOs, employers, as well as a voice given to the workers themselves. However, perhaps we should also refocus perceptions and terminology to better understand the position of the Arab Gulf states. Sensationalist language and generalist views will only exacerbate the problem. I'm hugely grateful to all my guests for participating in today's programme. Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, Professor Andrew Gardner, Rothna Begum, and of course my studio guests, Dr. Hilary Stauffer and Stephen Russell. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Until next time, goodbye.